Most travelers who venture into the high peaks expect to find solitude, perhaps a forgotten monastery or two, maybe the whisper of wind through ancient pines. What they don't expect, what nobody expects, is to stumble upon entire complexes of stone platforms built at altitudes where the air itself becomes your enemy, where no civilization should have had reason to build, yet where thousands of carefully carved steps lead to shrines that defy every practical explanation we can muster. These aren't the famous temples you've seen in documentaries. These are the ones that archaeologists argue about in hushed academic journals, the ones that make seasoned researchers pause mid-excavation and ask themselves whether everything they thought they understood about human capability might need revision. For the next hour, we're climbing together into elevations both literal and metaphorical, examining sites where devotion met impossibility, where engineering merged with obsession, where the mountains themselves became canvases for mysteries we still can't fully decode. You're going to hear about colossal platforms that shouldn't exist, given the tools available, about ritual centers placed so high that modern climbers need supplemental oxygen just to reach them, about carved monuments that align with celestial events in ways that suggest knowledge we can't quite explain. Some of these places were only rediscovered in the last few decades. Others have been hiding in plain sight for centuries, their true significance obscured by misinterpretation or deliberate concealment. We'll walk through competing theories, astronomers versus ritualists, engineers versus mystics, skeptics versus believers in lost ancient sciences. And here's what makes these mountain shrine mysteries so compelling. Every answer we find seems to generate 3 new questions. The more we excavate, the more we realize how much remains buried, not just in soil and stone, but in the gaps of our own understanding. So secure your mental climbing gear. We're heading up. The Khepra Terraces, perched at 4,200 meters in the eastern Himalayan range, near what is now the Bhutan-Tibet border, present archaeology with a problem that has no elegant solution. Here, sometime between 780 and 920 CE, a culture we can tentatively identify through pottery styles as proto-Bon practitioners, constructed a series of 17 massive stone terraces, each measuring approximately 40 meters in length and hewn from local granite using techniques that left no tool marks we can definitively identify. The terraces descend the mountainside in a deliberate cascade, each platform offset from the one above it by exactly 108 degrees of arc when measured from a central observation point, a number sacred in both Hindu and Buddhist cosmology, yet predating the widespread adoption of Buddhism in this region by at least a century. What were they building? The conventional interpretation holds that these terraces served as astronomical observation platforms, allowing priests to track solar and lunar cycles with precision necessary for agricultural planning. That's reasonable enough on its surface. But here's where the comfortable explanation starts to crumble. Recent soil analysis conducted by a joint Bhutanese-Swiss team in 2019 revealed that these terraces were never cultivated, never used for agriculture at all. The soil composition shows no evidence of the nitrogen enrichment you'd expect from crop rotation. No pollen deposits from domesticated grains, nothing that suggests anyone ever planted so much as a single seed on these laboriously constructed platforms. What the terraces do show, however, is something far stranger. Embedded in the granite at precise intervals, every third stone to be exact, are small cavities, roughly 10 centimeters deep and 5 centimeters in diameter, that once held something now lost. Residue analysis found traces of resinous compounds mixed with what appears to be animal fat, possibly from yak or mountain goat, combined with mineral pigments, including cinnabar and lapis lazuli. These aren't local minerals. The lapis lazuli, in particular, had to have traveled over 1,000 kilometers from deposits in what is now Afghanistan, suggesting trade networks of astonishing reach for a culture we barely know existed. The residue pattern suggests these cavities once held torches or some form of sustained flame, which means that on certain nights, we don't know which ones, we don't know how often, all 17 terraces would have blazed with hundreds of individual fires, visible for dozens of kilometers across the mountain valleys. Picture yourself as a traveler in the 9th century, crossing a high pass at dusk, and suddenly seeing the entire mountainside erupt into geometric patterns of flame, each point of light precisely positioned, the whole arrangement creating what must have looked like a stairway of fire ascending into the clouds. The psychological impact would have been overwhelming, a demonstration of power and coordination that announced, we can marshal the resources to set a mountain ablaze. But for what purpose? Theory 1 suggests these were beacon systems, part of a long-distance communication network that stretched across the Himalayan passes, allowing messages to travel in hours rather than days. The geometric precision supports this. You could encode information in which platforms were lit and which remained dark, creating a kind of binary language visible across vast distances. Theory 2, favored by scholars with a more ritual bent, argues that these were offering sites dedicated to mountain deities, the flames serving as prayers made visible, a way of literally illuminating the boundary between earth and sky. The number 108, the offset angles, the use of precious imported materials, all of this points towards ceremonial rather than practical function. Theory 3, and this one makes a lot of researchers uncomfortable, suggests astronomical calculation on a scale we haven't seen elsewhere in the region during this period. If you map the sight lines from the central observation point through the lit cavities on each terrace, you can track the movement of specific stars across the sky throughout the year. With practice, with generational knowledge transfer, you could create an astronomical calendar of remarkable accuracy using nothing but fire and stone and patience. Then there's the legend, the part that gets repeated in the villages below, and that serious archaeologists officially dismiss but privately wonder about. Local oral tradition, recorded by British surveyors in the 1890s and largely ignored until recently, speaks of the Sky Watchers, a priesthood of unusually tall individuals. The accounts consistently describe them as standing 2 heads taller than normal people, who supposedly built these terraces to anchor the stars to the earth during a period when the celestial order was threatened by chaos. The giant motif appears in multiple independent accounts from villages separated by significant distances, which suggests either a common origin story or, less likely but more tantalizing, the possibility that an actual group of distinctively tall individuals served as the ritual specialists for this mountaintop complex. We have no skeletal evidence to support this. The harsh altitude and acidic soil have left no preserved human remains that we've found. But the consistency of the legend across geographic barriers makes it harder to dismiss out of hand than we might like. Still, for all the excavation work, for all the soil samples and residue analysis and astronomical calculations, we still don't know who exactly built the Khepra Terraces, or why they chose this particular mountain, or what messages they might have been sending into the night sky. The fires went dark more than 1,000 years ago, and the priests who lit them left no written records, no explanations, just these platforms of stone and the fading memory of flames that made mountains speak. The carved channels of Quixal Ridge in the highlands of central Mexico, dating to approximately 400 to 650 CE, offer a different flavor of mountain mystery, one where water becomes the central obsession and where the engineering seems to exceed the need. The ridge itself rises abruptly from the surrounding plateau, a geological formation of volcanic basalt that creates a natural prominence overlooking what was once prime agricultural land in the valleys below. Sometime during the late Classic period, before the rise of the major Mesoamerican powers we're familiar with, an unknown culture, possibly related to the Teotihuacan sphere, but showing distinct artistic motifs, carved an intricate network of channels, gutters, and basins directly into the living rock of the ridge's summit. We're not talking about simple irrigation ditches. These are precisely engineered waterways, some measuring only 5 centimeters wide, but maintaining a consistent depth of exactly 3 centimeters for lengths of up to 40 meters, carved with such precision that modern engineers examining them have difficulty explaining how they were achieved without metal tools harder than the basalt itself. The channel network forms a pattern that, when viewed from above, something the builders presumably couldn't have done, resembles astronomical glyphs found in later Aztec codices, specifically those associated with Tlaloc, the rain deity. But here's the puzzle. Quixal Ridge sits at 2,800 meters elevation, well above the agricultural zones that would have benefited from irrigation, and the channels don't lead anywhere useful. They don't direct water to fields or settlements. Instead, they appear designed to capture rainfall and snowmelt and direct it into a series of stone basins carved at specific points along the ridge. These basins, 17 in total, each approximately 1 meter in diameter and 40 centimeters deep, show evidence of having been deliberately sealed and unsealed repeatedly. Chemical analysis of the stone surfaces reveals fluctuating mineral deposits consistent with cycles of water collection and evaporation, suggesting the basins were alternately filled and drained over extended periods. Why would anyone go to such extraordinary effort to collect water at high elevation only to let it evaporate? The discovery in 2017 of what researchers are calling the resonance chambers added another layer to the mystery. Beneath 5 of the basins, workers restoring the site after earthquake damage found that the carved receptacles weren't sitting on solid rock at all, but rather on thin stone caps, covering hollow chambers carved into the ridge itself. When you tap on these caps, and yes, archaeologists definitely tried this, they produce clear, bell-like tones that differ slightly from basin to basin. When filled with water to different levels, the pitch changes, creating what amounts to a massive stone xylophone that could produce a range of notes audible for kilometers across the mountain valleys. Now we're dealing with something that transcends simple water management and enters the realm of acoustic ritual. Imagine standing on this ridge during the rainy season, the channels filling and flowing with fresh water, the basins filling to calibrated levels, and then someone, a priest, an astronomer, an engineer, all of the above, striking these water-filled chambers in sequence, sending musical tones across the landscape, announcing the arrival of rain through sound as well as sight. The trade evidence from Quixal Ridge complicates the picture further. Excavations in the vicinity of the carved channels have uncovered obsidian tools from sources over 200 kilometers away, jade fragments that must have originated in the lowlands near what is now Guatemala, and perhaps most intriguingly, small copper bells of a design not seen elsewhere in the region during this time period. The bells, 14 were recovered during the 2018 season, show wear patterns suggesting they were suspended and struck repeatedly, likely as part of whatever rituals took place on the ridge. Copper metallurgy wasn't widespread in central Mexico during this period, which means either these bells were imported from considerable distances. The nearest known copper-working culture of this era would have been over 1,000 kilometers to the west, or we're dealing with an isolated technological innovation that somehow didn't spread to neighboring regions. Both options raise unsettling questions about our understanding of cultural contact and technological diffusion in pre-Columbian America. As for competing theories about Quixal Ridge's purpose, we have our usual lineup of contenders. The water management school argues that we're simply misunderstanding a sophisticated irrigation system, that there must have been agricultural terraces or settlements we haven't found yet that would explain the elaborate waterworks. The astronomical interpretation suggests the basins were used to create still water mirrors for observing celestial bodies, with the channels ensuring fresh, sediment-free water for maximum reflective clarity. The fact that several basins align with significant solar and lunar events lends weight to this view. The acoustic ritual faction, growing in influence, contends that the entire complex was a musical instrument for rain-calling ceremonies, a way of literally orchestrating precipitation through sympathetic magic. Water flowing through stone, stone singing with water, the priests mediating between earth and sky through precision engineering made audible. Then there's the cursed stone angle, the local tradition that gives the site its alternative name, El Canto de los Muertos, the Song of the Dead. According to stories collected from surrounding communities, the ridge was abandoned suddenly after a catastrophic storm, during which lightning struck the site repeatedly, killing the priests who were conducting a ceremony. The stone supposedly still sings during electrical storms, producing tones without human intervention, as atmospheric pressure changes interact with the carved chambers. Several local guides refuse to visit the site during storm season, and at least 2 archaeological teams have reported equipment malfunctions and unusual acoustic phenomena during weather events. We still don't know why the Quicksell Ridge complex was built with such precision, why the acoustic properties mattered so much, or what happened to the culture that invested such extraordinary effort into carving music and meaning into a mountain of stone. The channels still capture rain when it falls. The basins still fill and empty with the seasons. And the stone still sings when conditions are right. But the songs have no listeners who remember what they mean. The Talvern Sanctuary, hidden in a narrow defile of the Carpathian Mountains in what is now eastern Romania, presents one of the more unsettling archaeological discoveries of the past 3 decades. The site, only systematically excavated beginning in 2003, consists of 38 stone structures arranged in 3 concentric circles around a central platform carved from a single massive boulder of limestone. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials found at the site places construction sometime between 1100 and 900 BCE during the Late Bronze Age in a region and period where we don't expect to find monumental stone architecture of this sophistication. The structures themselves are modest in scale. The tallest stands only about 2 meters high, but their construction shows an understanding of stoneworking that seems anomalous for the time and place. Each structure is built from carefully shaped limestone blocks that interlock without mortar, using a technique that wouldn't become common in this region for another 500 years. More remarkably, each structure contains a small interior chamber, roughly 1 meter square, with a domed ceiling constructed using corbelling techniques that require precise calculation to prevent collapse. What were these chambers for? The evidence, such as it is, points toward ritualized deposition of objects we can't fully interpret. In 27 of the 38 chambers, excavators found ceramic vessels, always exactly 3 per chamber, containing residues of burnt plant materials, animal bones, primarily deer and wild boar, and in several cases, small bronze objects, including pins, rings, and spiral ornaments. The bronze objects are what made headlines, because their composition includes tin concentrations consistent with sources in Cornwall, England, over 2,500 kilometers away. We're talking about a Bronze Age sanctuary in the Carpathian Mountains, using materials that originated on the Atlantic coast of Britain, which implies either direct trade connections of remarkable extent or a series of intermediary exchanges so numerous that the cultural significance of these bronze objects must have been extraordinary to justify their journey. The ceramic vessels show decorative motifs that don't match any known culture group from the region, featuring abstract geometric patterns and, intriguingly, repeated images of what appear to be stylized mountains with circles or spheres hovering above their peaks, possible representations of the sun or moon, or possibly something else entirely. The central platform adds another dimension to the mystery. The limestone boulder from which it was carved measures approximately 4 meters across and stands 1 meter high. Its surface worked completely flat, with a precision that required serious time investment. Carved into this platform are 38 cup marks, exactly matching the number of stone structures surrounding it, arranged in a pattern that initially looks random, but that careful surveying has revealed to be anything but. When you connect the cup marks with sight lines extending to the surrounding structures, the pattern resolves into a map of the night sky as it would have appeared in approximately 1000 BCE, with the cup marks representing the brightest stars in several prominent constellations, including what we now call Ursa Major, Cassiopeia, and Cygnus. This suggests that the entire sanctuary was conceived as a three-dimensional star map, with the stone structures representing celestial bodies and the central platform serving as the observation and orientation point. Astronomical function, ritual deposition, long-distance trade connections. The pieces fit together to suggest a ceremonial center of regional importance, a place where Bronze Age people came to engage with cosmic order through material offerings and architectural symbolism. But then there are the bones. In 2011, excavators working on the perimeter of the site uncovered a deposit that changed the conversation. Buried in a shallow pit about 15 meters from the outermost circle of structures, they found partial skeletal remains of at least 8 individuals, buried in what appears to have been a single event. The bones show evidence of violent trauma, cut marks consistent with bronze weapons, depressed fractures in several skulls, and more disturbing still, signs of deliberate mutilation post-mortem. Several of the long bones had been split open, possibly to extract marrow. 2 skulls show carefully drilled holes, made after death, for unknown purposes. Osteological analysis indicates all 8 individuals were adult males, unusually tall for the period, with several showing skeletal features, suggesting they came from different geographic origins. Bone chemistry points to childhood spent in regions hundreds of kilometers apart. Were these sacrificial victims, war captives, priests from distant regions who met violent ends? The context doesn't give us clear answers. The burial pit contains none of the ritual deposits found in the stone chambers. No bronze, no ceramics, nothing that suggests ceremonial treatment. These people were put into the ground quickly and without evident care. The competing theories about Talvern Sanctuary now have to account for this violent evidence. The astronomical interpretation struggles to explain why a sophisticated celestial observatory would be associated with what looks like ritual violence, or at least violent death. The Trade Center hypothesis works better. Perhaps these were merchants or emissaries caught up in conflicts over control of valuable routes, their deaths marking a moment when the sanctuary's protective neutrality was violated. The most unsettling interpretation, gaining traction among researchers willing to consider darker possibilities, suggests that Talvern was never primarily astronomical or commercial, but rather represented a cult center where long-distance pilgrims came to participate in rites that occasionally turned fatal, where the connection between earth and sky was forged through blood as well as bronze. Local legends, recorded in fragments by medieval chroniclers who probably never visited the site, speak of the star priests who drank the sky and who were eventually destroyed by those they ruled, driven from their mountain sanctuary and hunted through the forests. The tall skeletons, the foreign origins, the violent ends. You can see how the legend might have roots in actual events, even if the details have been transformed by centuries of retelling. We still don't know who built Talvern Sanctuary, why they invested such effort in creating a stone model of the heavens, or what transpired to end with violent deaths and hasty burial. The structures remain intact. The cup marks still map the stars, and the mountain defile still holds its secrets close, offering us fragments and forcing us to construct narratives that may or may not approach the truth of what happened on this ridge more than 3,000 years ago. The Jinsei platforms of northern Japan, specifically in the mountainous terrain of Akita Prefecture, present a puzzle that combines elements of engineering ambition with religious devotion in proportions that don't quite make sense. These platforms, 11 have been confirmed, though local tradition insists there were originally 13, were constructed sometime between 650 and 750 CE during the early Nara period, at a time when centralized state power was just beginning to extend into the northern regions of Honshu. Each platform consists of a foundation of river stones, carefully selected for size uniformity, topped with a layer of compacted earth, and finally surfaced with flat stone slabs that create a level area measuring approximately 8 meters by 10 meters. The platforms sit at elevations ranging from 4,200 to 1,600 meters, positioned on ridgelines that offer commanding views of the surrounding valleys, but that also require significant effort to reach. The nearest permanent settlement, even in the period of construction, would have been at least a day's journey on foot from the lowest platform. What makes the Jinsei platforms remarkable isn't their individual construction, which, while labor-intensive, is well within the capabilities of Nara period engineering, but rather their precise spatial relationship to one another. When surveyed with modern GPS equipment, researchers discovered that all 11 platforms form sightline connections that create a network visible across the mountainous terrain. From any one platform, you can see at least 2 others, and from several central platforms, you can see up to 5. More intriguingly, the platforms are positioned such that if fires were lit on each one simultaneously, an observer at a specific location in the valley below, a location that happens to coincide with the ruins of what may have been a small temple complex, would see the fires align to form a representation of the constellation we know as Orion, rotated 90 degrees and scaled up to fill the mountainside. This wasn't discovered until 2009, when a Japanese graduate student analyzing historical astronomical records realized that the platform positions matched star positions from 8th century sky maps. The implication is staggering. Someone in the 8th century possessed the surveying skills, astronomical knowledge, and organizational capability to position 11 separate structures across multiple mountains to create a ground-based mirror of the heavens, visible only from one specific vantage point. The archaeological evidence from the platforms themselves adds layers to the mystery. Excavations conducted between 2012 and 2018 uncovered ceramic fragments, iron tools, and most significantly, small bronze mirrors of a type associated with Shinto ritual practice. Bronze mirrors in early Japanese culture were believed to house spirits, to serve as interfaces between the physical and divine realms, and their presence at these remote mountain platforms suggests religious function beyond simple astronomical observation. The mirror fragments show damage consistent with deliberate destruction. They were broken intentionally, not through accident or decay, and chemical analysis of the bronze composition indicates they were manufactured in the Yamato heartland, hundreds of kilometers to the south, before being transported north to these mountains. Why break valuable imported ritual objects? One interpretation holds that the breaking was itself the ritual, a way of releasing the spirits contained within the mirrors, allowing them to disperse into the mountain landscape. Another view suggests that the mirrors were broken during a period of political or religious upheaval, part of a deliberate effort to terminate whatever practices had been conducted on these platforms. The skeletal evidence from Jinsai complicates matters further. In 2015, excavators working on the third platform discovered a burial cairn that had been constructed against the platform's retaining wall. The cairn contained the remains of a single individual, an adult male approximately 50 years old at death, buried in a seated position facing northeast, the direction traditionally associated with the Buddhist paradise in Japanese belief. Osteological analysis revealed something unexpected. The individual showed signs of chronic malnutrition and repeated physical trauma, including healed fractures in both legs and several ribs. His teeth were worn in patterns suggesting a lifetime of chewing tough, fibrous materials, possibly plant fibers or poorly processed grains. This was not a person of high status, not a priest or noble, whose burial would merit special treatment. Yet he was interred at a platform that required sophisticated astronomical knowledge to position, wrapped in silk textile fragments that isotope analysis traces to Chinese manufacture, accompanied by a bronze mirror and a small cache of polished stone beads. The contradiction between his physical condition, suggesting a life of hardship and labor, and his burial goods, suggesting access to luxury imports, remains unresolved. The mythic dimension of Jinsai centers on the legend of the mountain hermits, ascetic practitioners who supposedly withdrew from society to maintain vigil at these remote platforms, lighting sacred fires at prescribed times to maintain cosmic harmony. The legend, recorded in various forms in the Akita region, describes these hermits as individuals capable of surviving without food for extended periods, of communicating across vast distances through methods that aren't specified, and of predicting natural disasters before they occurred. The historical core of this legend, if any exists, might relate to actual religious specialists who staffed these platforms, perhaps rotating duty or living in seasonal encampments that have left no archaeological trace. The chronic malnutrition and trauma evident in the skeletal remains certainly fit with a lifestyle of extreme ascetic practice. But the astronomical precision, the long-distance trade goods, the coordinated network of sight lines, these elements suggest institutional support, planning, and resources that go well beyond what isolated hermits could have mustered. Someone with power and wealth wanted these platforms built, positioned exactly where they are, and maintained for purposes we can only partially reconstruct. Competing theories about Jinsai's function range from the practical to the esoteric. The communication network interpretation argues that the platform served as a signal system, allowing messages to travel rapidly across the mountains through fire signals or smoke, perhaps as part of an early warning system for frontier defense. The astronomical temple view holds that these were observation sites for tracking celestial events, possibly to maintain a calendar for agricultural or religious purposes, with the constellation alignment being either symbolic or functional, depending on which scholar you ask. The most speculative theory, and the one that makes many archaeologists uncomfortable, suggests that Jinsai represents evidence of a lost religious movement, possibly a syncretistic blend of indigenous mountain worship and imported Buddhist cosmology that operated in the mountains for a brief period before being suppressed by centralizing state authorities. The deliberate destruction of the mirrors, the burial of an individual who appears to have lived a life of extreme hardship, the eventual abandonment of the platforms, these could all be read as signs of a tradition that ended not through natural decline, but through external intervention. We still don't know who conceived the Jinsai platform network, how they achieved the precision necessary to align structures across multiple mountains, or what ceremonies were conducted on these wind-swept ridges that required mirrors, silk, and suffering. The platforms remain, slowly surrendering to forest growth and erosion, their astronomical alignments still perfect, their secrets still largely intact. The Zervan cairns of the Altai Mountains, straddling the borders of modern Russia, Mongolia, and Kazakhstan, represent one of the most extensive yet least understood megalithic complexes in Central Asia. The cairns, over 200 have been documented, though erosion and modern development have likely destroyed others, date to a broad period between 800 and 400 BCE during the Scythian cultural horizon, though some may be significantly older. Each cairn consists of a central stone chamber, roughly 2 meters square and 1 to 1.5 meters high, constructed from unworked granite boulders, surrounded by a circular mound of smaller stones that extends outward to create structures ranging from 5 to 15 meters in diameter. What distinguishes the Zervan cairns from other burial monuments of the period is their consistent placement at high elevation, typically above 2,500 meters, and their apparent lack of human remains. Out of the 83 cairns that have been systematically excavated, only 9 contained skeletal material, and those burials appear to be later intrusions rather than original interments. If these aren't tombs, what were they? The contents of the stone chambers offer tantalizing but incomplete answers. Repeated patterns emerge across multiple cairns: fire-cracked rocks indicating intense heat, charcoal deposits, fragments of ceramic vessels that once held liquids or offerings, animal bones, predominantly horse, with some sheep and cattle, and scattered small objects including bronze arrowheads, iron knife blades, and occasionally gold foil fragments. In 17 cairns, excavators found distinctive stone slabs carved with petroglyphs showing stylized animals, primarily deer with exaggerated antlers, and abstract symbols that might represent astronomical phenomena or might be purely decorative. The gold foil is particularly interesting because metallurgical analysis shows it comes from multiple distant sources, some from as far as the Urals, over 1,500 kilometers to the west. The presence of precious materials from distant regions suggests these cairns were significant enough to attract offerings from wide geographic areas, that people traveled considerable distances to deposit materials at these remote mountain sites. The spatial arrangement of the Zervan cairns is where the mystery deepens into something approaching the uncanny. When researchers began mapping cairn locations systematically in the early 2000s, they noticed that the structures weren't randomly scattered, but followed distinct linear patterns. Strings of cairns, sometimes 7 or 8 in sequence, would march across ridgelines in roughly straight lines, sometimes extending for 20 or 30 kilometers. Initially interpreted as trail markers or boundary monuments, these linear arrangements gained new significance when a Russian-Mongolian research team demonstrated in 2014 that several of the cairn lines aligned with the sunrise position on the winter solstice, as seen from specific valley locations. Moreover, when you map the cairn positions and connect them with sight lines, certain geometric patterns emerge, not perfect shapes, but close enough to suggest intentionality. One cluster of 37 cairns, when connected, forms a rough approximation of a spiral pattern, though whether this was deliberate design or coincidental arrangement remains hotly debated. The mythic traditions associated with the Zervan cairns vary by ethnic group, but share certain core elements. Mongol herders in the region describe them as soul houses, built by an ancient race to trap malevolent spirits, preventing them from wandering the mountains and afflicting the living. Kazakh oral tradition speaks of the cairns as markers of a vast battlefield, where 2 armies of sky warriors fought a war that reshaped the landscape, with each cairn marking where a champion fell. Russian Orthodox missionaries who ventured into the Altai in the 19th century recorded local beliefs that the cairns were built by giants, a race of powerful beings who preceded human occupation of the mountains and who possessed knowledge of stone and sky that enabled them to command both. The giant motif appears in multiple independent sources, always associated with claims that the cairns contain bones of stone, which might be a poetic description of the megalithic construction itself, or might preserve folk memory of mineral deposits or fossil discoveries that early peoples couldn't explain. In 2008, excavators at one of the larger cairns did indeed find a concentration of fossilized bone fragments, later identified as belonging to Pleistocene megafauna, which had somehow been incorporated into the cairn structure. Whether deliberately or accidentally, we cannot say. The competing scholarly interpretations of the Zervan cairns reflect ongoing debates about how we understand ritual landscapes. The astronomical school argues that the cairns represent an elaborate system for tracking celestial events, with the linear arrangements serving as sight lines for observing solar and stellar positions throughout the year. The sheer number of cairns in this view reflects the complexity of the calendar system and the need for multiple observation points to account for variations in terrain and seasonal visibility. The ritual landscape theory suggests instead that the cairns mark sacred geography, identifying places where the boundary between physical and spiritual realms was believed to be permeable, with the offerings and fires representing attempts to communicate with or appease otherworldly powers. The territorial marker hypothesis, more prosaic but perhaps more plausible, holds that the cairns delineated grazing territories or trade routes, with their high elevation, placement ensuring visibility across vast distances, the offerings serving social rather than supernatural functions, binding communities to specific landscapes through repeated acts of deposition. Then there's the problem of abandonment. Sometime around 400 BCE, possibly earlier in some locations, people stopped building cairns, stopped making offerings, stopped maintaining the sites. The cessation appears relatively sudden rather than gradual, without obvious environmental or political triggers. No invasion is recorded, no climate shift dramatic enough to force population movements, no epidemic documented in the skeletal record from surrounding areas. The cairns simply fell silent, their chambers slowly filling with wind-blown soil, their exterior stone mounds beginning the long process of dissolution. Why? What changed in the religious or social systems that made these monuments no longer necessary or desirable? We have theories but little concrete evidence. Perhaps the rise of more centralized political authorities eliminated the decentralized ritual networks the cairns represented. Perhaps a religious transformation, possibly early contact with Buddhism spreading from the south, rendered the old practices obsolete. Perhaps nothing more dramatic than generational change occurred, each successive generation caring slightly less about maintaining traditions they didn't fully understand, until finally, no one remembered why the cairns had mattered. We still don't know who built the Zervan cairns in such numbers, why they invested such effort in transporting stones to high elevations, or what they hoped to accomplish through their careful arrangements and repeated offerings. The structures endure, slowly merging back into the mountainsides that hosted them, their patterns still visible to anyone willing to look, their meanings still stubbornly resistant to definitive interpretation. The Pindral circles of the Western Ghats in India, discovered only in 1998 during a forestry survey near the Karnataka-Goa border, consist of 41 stone circles constructed on a high plateau at approximately 900 meters elevation. Radiocarbon dating of charcoal samples from excavated contexts places their construction between 1200 and 900 BCE, during the late Harappan period, though the circles show no obvious connection to Harappan cultural material. Each circle measures between 4 and 7 meters in diameter, constructed from laterite blocks, stone formed from weathered basaltic rock, that have been roughly shaped but not extensively dressed. The circles aren't fully enclosed. Each has an opening facing southeast, and the blocks are arranged in a single course, never stacked higher than a meter. Within the circles, excavations have revealed fire pits, invariably placed at the exact center of each circle, surrounded by evidence of repeated burning events. The quantity of charcoal and fire-altered soil suggests these weren't single-use features, but rather fire pits that were utilized multiple times over extended periods, possibly spanning decades or even centuries. What immediately strikes researchers about the Pindrel circles is their relationship to the surrounding landscape. The plateau where they're located is relatively flat, about 4 hectares in extent, surrounded by steep terrain that makes access difficult from most directions. There's no permanent water source on the plateau itself. The nearest stream requires a descent of approximately 150 meters elevation and a horizontal distance of about 2 kilometers. The plateau offers no obvious subsistence advantages. The soil is thin and rocky. The vegetation is scrub forest with limited wild food resources. The exposure is severe during monsoon season. Yet someone chose this isolated, inhospitable location to construct 41 stone circles and maintain fires within them over what appears to have been a considerable time span. The excavated material from within the circles adds to the puzzle. Archaeologists have found fragments of decorated pottery, with motifs unlike those from known contemporary cultures. Small copper objects, including pins, and what might be seal stamp fragments, carnelian beads worked in styles, suggesting long-distance trade connections, and most unexpectedly, fragments of worked ivory. Ivory in the Western Ghats during this period most likely came from elephants, but the worked pieces show sophisticated carving techniques and possibly represent imported items from regions with more developed ivory working traditions. The discovery in 2006 of the offering pits transformed the conversation about Pindrel's purpose. Outside the stone circles, at irregular intervals around the plateau's perimeter, excavators found 16 deep pits, cylindrical shafts extending 2 to 3 meters into the laterite bedrock, clearly excavated with considerable effort. These pits contained layers of material, burnt offerings apparently, deposited sequentially over time. The contents are bizarre, at least from a utilitarian perspective. Layers of burnt grain, identified as early millet varieties, ash deposits, broken pottery, burnt bone from multiple animal species, including wild boar, deer, and several unidentified species, and layers of what appears to be burnt textile or plant fiber material. Near the bottom of several pits, excavators found large river-worn stones, some weighing over 50 kilograms, that had been transported to the site from significant distances. The nearest river with stones of this size is over 10 kilometers away down in the valleys. Why deposit heavy river stones in deep pits on a mountain plateau? The only interpretation that makes sense within a ritual framework is that these stones represented something symbolically significant, perhaps water sources, perhaps riverine spirits or deities, perhaps ancestral connections to valley homelands. The astronomical alignments at Pindrel are less dramatic than at some mountain shrine sites, but still present. The southeast-facing openings in the stone circles, when you map their sight lines, point toward the position of sunrise during the winter solstice. During this time of year, which coincides with the dry season in the Western Ghats, an observer standing at the center of any circle would see the sun rise precisely through the gap in the stones. If fires were lit in all 41 circles simultaneously at dawn on the winter solstice, the visual effect would be remarkable. 41 pillars of smoke rising into the morning sky, visible from the valleys below, announcing what exactly? The return of the sun, the beginning of a new seasonal cycle, the presence of a religious community maintaining vigil on the mountain? All of these are plausible. None are provable. The competing theories about Pindrel reflect the ambiguity of the evidence. The seasonal ceremonial center interpretation suggests that groups ascended to the plateau during specific times of year to conduct rituals, possibly related to agricultural cycles, before returning to permanent settlements in the valleys. The evidence for repeated use of the fire pits and the sequential deposition in the offering pits supports this view. These were periodic rather than continuous activities. The initiation site theory, favored by scholars interested in social structures, proposes that Pindrel served as a location for transformative rituals, possibly marking transitions from childhood to adulthood, with the difficult access, isolated location, and ceremonial architecture creating an appropriate setting for liminal experiences. The mortuary interpretation, still defended by some researchers despite the limited skeletal evidence, suggests that the circles were cremation platforms and that most bone was fully calcined and either scattered or deposited in locations we haven't excavated. The cursed sanctuary angle comes from a different direction entirely. In 2009, 2 members of an archaeological team working at Pindrel reported experiencing intense psychological distress during excavations, including visual hallucinations and severe anxiety, symptoms that resolved after they left the site. Later investigation suggested possible exposure to natural toxins. Certain fungi that grow in the laterite formations can produce alkaloid compounds that affect neurological function when disturbed. Whether ancient peoples experienced similar effects and incorporated them into ritual practice is unknowable but intriguing. Local tradition, what little survives among tribal communities in the region, describes the plateau as a place where the ancestors speak and warns against visiting during the monsoon season when lightning strikes are frequent. Several of the stone circles show evidence of lightning damage, with stones fractured and displaced in patterns consistent with electrical discharge. We still don't know who built the Pindrel circles, why they chose such an isolated and challenging location, or what they believed they were accomplishing through their fires and offerings. The circles remain, slowly being reclaimed by forest growth, the fire pits cold for 3,000 years, the offering pits sealed beneath soil and time, holding questions we may never fully answer. The Hebron platforms of the Pyrenees, specifically in a remote valley system near the France-Spain border at approximately 1,800 meters elevation, represent the most recent major mountain shrine discovery in Europe. The site was only identified in 2015 when a shepherd following a stray sheep discovered the first platform hidden beneath centuries of accumulated soil and vegetation. Subsequent surveys revealed 9 separate platforms, all constructed between approximately 500 and 300 BCE during the Iron Age, in a region where Celtic and Iberian cultural influences intersected. Each platform consists of a rectangular foundation of dry stacked schist stone, the local bedrock, measuring approximately 6 by 8 meters, with surfaces carefully leveled using smaller stone chinking and compacted gravel. The platforms are positioned at different elevations within the valley system, connected by what appear to be deliberately engineered pathways. Not roads exactly, but cleared routes marked at intervals with standing stones, creating a processional route that links all 9 platforms in a sequence that requires approximately 4 hours to walk at a moderate pace. The excavations conducted between 2016 and 2023 revealed construction techniques and associated materials that have forced revisions to our understanding of Iron Age engineering in the region. The platform foundations, when excavated, showed evidence of sophisticated drainage systems, stone channels built into the platform structures that directed water away from the surfaces, preventing undermining and collapse. This level of engineering sophistication, while not unknown in Iron Age Europe, is unexpected in such remote mountain locations. The material culture recovered from the platforms includes Iron Age pottery, with decorative motifs combining Celtic Latin-style elements with geometric patterns more typical of Iberian cultures, iron tools including knives, awls, and agricultural implements, bronze fibulae, safety pin-style garment fasteners of types found across a wide geographic range, and most significantly, small gold objects, including spirals, rings, and sheet gold fragments. The gold objects, analyzed for trace element composition, originate from multiple sources, including deposits in northern Spain, southern France, and possibly even the British Isles, suggesting these platforms attracted offerings from remarkably distant origins. The most extraordinary find at Hebron came from the 7th platform excavated, where archaeologists uncovered a stone-lined pit containing a cache of wooden objects preserved in the unique microenvironment created by specific soil chemistry and consistent cool temperatures. The cache included carved wooden staffs decorated with animal heads, identified as horses, bulls, and birds, wooden bowls, and fragments of what appear to be wooden idols, or ritual figures showing humanoid forms with exaggerated features. Radiocarbon dating places these objects to approximately 350 BCE, making them among the best preserved Iron Age wooden artifacts from anywhere in Europe. The preservation allows us to see details of carving techniques, tool marks, and even traces of pigments that indicate the objects were originally painted. The iconography connects to known Celtic religious symbolism, but shows distinctive local variations that suggest either isolated development or synthesis with other traditions. The wooden idols, 3 were sufficiently intact for detailed analysis. All display similar characteristics: elongated bodies, oversized heads with prominent eyes, and what might be representations of torques or neck rings, symbols of status in Celtic society. The arrangement of the platforms within the valley system isn't random. When mapped, the platforms form 2 parallel lines ascending the valley, with the pathways connecting them in a zigzag pattern that requires walkers to cross back and forth across the valley floor multiple times. This layout creates a labyrinthine effect, transforming what could have been a simple linear procession into something more complex and deliberate. Researchers walking the route report that the constant direction changes, combined with the elevation gain and the mountainous terrain, create a disorienting experience that might have been intentionally designed to induce altered states of consciousness or to symbolically represent journey and transformation. The time required to complete the circuit, 4 hours minimum, and the physical effort involved suggest that traversing the platform system was itself a significant undertaking, possibly a pilgrimage or initiatory experience that required commitment and endurance. The mythic dimension of Hebron comes not from local legend, as the site was unknown until recently, but from pan-Celtic traditions about mountain sanctuaries. Ancient writers, including Strabo and Diodorus Siculus, recorded accounts from Celtic territories describing religious ceremonies conducted in mountain locations where practitioners would fast, walk prescribed routes, and seek visions through ordeal and isolation. While these classical sources don't specifically mention the Pyrenees, the pattern they describe, remote mountain sanctuaries, processional routes, offerings of valuable materials, wooden idols, aligns closely with what we've found at Hebron. The giant element, common in mountain mythology across Europe, appears in later medieval sources from the Pyrenees that describe an ancient race of builders who constructed pathways and sacred sites in the high mountains before the arrival of current inhabitants. Whether these legends preserve genuine folk memory of Iron Age religious practices or represent later mythologization is debatable, but the consistency across Celtic regions of mountain sanctuary traditions suggests some historical core to the stories. Competing theories about Hebron's function reflect disciplinary perspectives. The religious sanctuary interpretation, currently dominant, views the platform complex as a ceremonial center where Celtic communities conducted seasonal rituals, possibly related to solar events or agricultural cycles, with the processional route serving to prepare participants psychologically and spiritually for ceremonies conducted on the platforms themselves. The social integration hypothesis suggests that the platforms served as neutral meeting places where different tribal groups could interact, exchange goods, resolve disputes, and reinforce alliances, with the religious activities providing a framework for what were fundamentally political and economic gatherings. The resistance sanctuary theory, more speculative but gaining consideration, proposes that Hebron was established during periods of external threat, possibly during early Roman expansion into the region, as a refuge sanctuary where religious specialists maintained traditional practices away from lowland areas subject to foreign control. The sudden abandonment of the site around 300 BCE, coinciding roughly with increased Roman activity in the region, lends some support to this interpretation. Then there's the environmental evidence, which complicates all these theories. Paleoecological analysis of soil samples from the platforms shows something unexpected: evidence of deliberate burning of vegetation around the platforms at regular intervals, creating maintained clearings in what would otherwise have been forested terrain. The burning pattern suggests organized landscape management, transforming the natural environment to serve ritual purposes, making the platforms visible from distance and from each other. This represents a significant investment of labor. Forest clearing requires persistent effort and indicates that maintaining the ceremonial landscape was as important as constructing the platforms themselves. The cleared areas also facilitated congregation. Several platforms have surrounding spaces large enough to accommodate groups of 50 or more people, suggesting ceremonies that involved considerable participation rather than small, exclusive ritual specialist groups. We still don't know exactly who built the Hebron platforms, which communities traveled there, what specific ceremonies were conducted during those 4-hour mountain circuits, or why the site was abandoned apparently rather abruptly. The platforms remain, slowly being cleared of the vegetation that concealed them for millennia, their processional pathways becoming visible again, inviting us to walk routes laid out by people whose beliefs and purposes we can only partially reconstruct through fragments of wood and stone and gold. These mountain shrines scattered across continents and centuries share certain qualities that speak to something fundamental in human spiritual experience. We build high because height transforms perspective, because mountains occupy the boundary between earth and sky, because ascending requires effort that transforms casual curiosity into committed pilgrimage. The people who constructed these sites weren't merely responding to practical needs. They were reaching towards something that required them to carry stone and gold and devotion to places where breathing is difficult, where weather is hostile, where survival itself demands constant attention. And yet they went, generation after generation, maintaining sites that offered no obvious material benefit, investing resources that could have been used for clearly practical purposes, all in service of beliefs and visions we can only partially access through archaeological fragments. What unites the Khepra Terraces with their fire stairways to the stars? Quicksall Ridge, with its water music carved into stone. Talvern Sanctuary, with its sky map architecture and its violent secrets. The Jinsai platforms with their constellation of sightlines. Zervan cairns spreading across the Altai in mysterious spirals. Pindrel circles with their offering pits and ivory fragments. Hebron platforms with their preserved wooden gods. What unites them all is the evidence they provide of human capacity for vision, for conceiving possibilities that exceed immediate survival needs. These sites required planning across generations, coordination across communities, transmission of specialized knowledge, accumulation and expenditure of surplus resources. They represent moments when human societies decided that connecting with cosmic order, marking sacred geography, or maintaining relationships with powers beyond the visible world justified significant communal investment. This isn't primitive superstition. This is sophisticated cultural production, the creation of monumental architecture in service of ideas. And yet we stand before these sites with our measuring tools and our excavation permits and our chemical analyses, and we realize how much remains opaque to us. We can determine when they were built, often within a century or two. We can identify what materials were used, and sometimes where those materials originated. We can map spatial relationships and identify astronomical alignments. We can analyze bones and charcoal and metal traces. But we cannot stand inside the consciousness of the people who built these places. We cannot feel what they felt when they lit fires on 17 terraces and watched the mountain blaze with geometric precision. We cannot hear the tones that echoed across the valleys when water-filled chambers rang with carefully orchestrated strikes. We cannot access the meanings that Bronze Age peoples attached to bronze mirrors from Cornwall buried in the Carpathian mountains. We cannot know whether the people who traversed the Jinsei platform network genuinely believed they were maintaining cosmic balance, or whether they understood their activities as something else entirely. Political display, social bonding, aesthetic expression, categories that might not even map cleanly onto 8th century worldviews. The giants and curses and lost tribes that cluster around these sites in local traditions aren't just colorful additions to archaeological narratives. They represent attempts by later peoples to make sense of monumental works they couldn't explain within their own cultural frameworks. When medieval villagers encountered stone terraces built with precision their own societies couldn't match, attributing them to giants made sense. It preserved the mystery while providing an explanation scaled to the impressiveness of the remains. When communities living near abandoned sanctuaries tried to understand why their ancestors had invested such effort in remote mountains, curse narratives emerged. The sites must have been abandoned because something went wrong, because cosmic forces were disturbed, because boundaries were violated. These later interpretations aren't historically accurate, but they're psychologically revealing. They show us that the strangeness of these sites, their resistance to easy explanation, isn't just a modern problem. People have been puzzling over these mountain shrines for centuries, trying to reconcile monumental evidence with believable human capabilities. This brings us to a humbling recognition. Our current interpretations, no matter how scientifically grounded, are also provisional, also shaped by our own cultural assumptions about what makes sense. We favor astronomical explanations because we live in a culture that values scientific knowledge and views ancient peoples as proto-scientists working with limited tools. We emphasize trade networks and social complexity because our theoretical frameworks prioritize economic and political interpretations. We look for rational functions, communication, defense, calendar keeping, because we're uncomfortable attributing major investments of labor to purely symbolic or spiritual motivations. But what if we're wrong? What if the people who built these sites operated from belief systems so different from ours that our categories fundamentally mischaracterize their intentions? What if they were indeed attempting something we'd consider impossible, communicating with entities we don't believe exist, manipulating forces we don't recognize, achieving transformations we can't imagine? And what if their own criteria for success bore no relationship to the material traces we excavate? This isn't an argument for abandoning scientific archaeology in favor of mystical speculation. The evidence-based approach is essential. It's how we distinguish fantasy from plausible reconstruction. But it is an argument for maintaining appropriate humility about the limits of our interpretive reach. When we stand on a mountain plateau surrounded by 41 stone circles that required immense effort to construct and maintain, when we try to imagine what people 3,000 years ago were thinking and feeling and hoping to accomplish, we should acknowledge that our best reconstructions are always partial, always filtered through our own cultural lenses, always vulnerable to future discoveries that might radically transform our understanding. The sites aren't puzzles with definitive solutions waiting to be discovered. They're windows into human diversity across time, reminders that our species has expressed itself through countless cultural forms, many of which remain only partially legible to us. Yet there's something profoundly moving about the attempt itself, about the archaeological project of reaching across centuries and cultural divides to establish contact, however imperfect, with people who share our fundamental humanity, but expressed it through radically different forms. When we map the sight lines connecting Jinsai platforms and realize someone in the 8th century possessed the knowledge and determination to create a terrestrial mirror of the stars, we're touching something that transcends specific cultural explanations. When we analyze the acoustic properties of Quicksal Ridge and understand that stone was made to sing with water, we're recognizing creative genius that spans the gap between their world and ours. When we examine the wooden idols from Hebron, preserved by accident of chemistry, and see the tool marks left by an Iron Age carver who shaped divinity from oak, we're as close as archaeology ever gets to meeting an individual across the millennia. These mountain shrines remain active sites, not in the sense that ceremonies are still performed there, but in the sense that they continue to generate meaning, to provoke questions, to inspire wonder. Each new excavation season produces data that confirms some interpretations, challenges others, and opens entirely new avenues of inquiry. Each application of new analytical techniques, satellite imaging, environmental DNA analysis, isotope geochemistry, computational modeling, reveals patterns that weren't previously visible, adding layers to our understanding while simultaneously highlighting how much we still don't know. The sites grow richer rather than simpler as we study them more carefully, their complexities multiplying rather than resolving into tidy explanations. Perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps the essential mystery of these places, not the solvable puzzles about construction dates and artifact sources, but the deeper mystery of human motivation and meaning, is meant to remain partially intact, a reminder that the past is genuinely foreign territory, where we are visitors who will always speak the language imperfectly. The platforms and cairns and terraces and circles aren't demanding that we solve them. They're inviting us to engage with them, to bring our questions and our tools and our imaginations, to construct the best interpretations we can while remaining open to the likelihood that final, complete understanding lies forever beyond our reach. So we keep digging. We keep mapping and measuring and analyzing. We keep proposing theories and testing them against evidence. We keep discovering new sites that expand the geographic and temporal range of mountain shrine traditions. And we keep feeling that mixture of excitement and frustration that characterizes any attempt to understand human behavior across vast stretches of time. The Khepra Terraces still mark their mountain with geometric precision. The channels of Quicksal Ridge still fill with water when rain falls. The Talvern Sanctuary still maps the stars, though no priests remain to read them. The Jinsai platforms still command their ridgelines, silent observers of the valleys below. The Zervan cairns still stand across the Altai, marking landscapes according to logics we're still working to decipher. The Pindrel circles still await the fires that haven't been lit in 3 millennia. The Hebron platforms still trace their processional route through the Pyrenees, a path that leads to destinations both geographic and spiritual. These are the places where our ancestors chose to build high, to reach toward sky, to create permanence from stone in locations that barely sustain human presence. These are the sites where devotion met engineering, where vision met labor, where communities invested collective resources in projects that served purposes beyond immediate survival. Understanding them fully may be impossible. Respecting them, learning what we can from them, and recognizing in them the complex creativity of human cultural expression, that's within our grasp. The mountain shrines keep their secrets, but they offer us something valuable nonetheless. Evidence of human capacity for creating meaning in a universe that provides none ready-made. Proof that we've always been a species that builds not just for shelter, but for significance. Keep digging. Keep questioning. Keep looking up at the mountains where stones were carefully placed by hands long gone, where fires once blazed to communicate messages we're still trying to decode, where paths were worn by feet walking toward destinations that remain, even now, partially hidden in fog and time. Some secrets still lie just beneath your feet, waiting not for definitive answers, but for the next careful excavation, the next thoughtful interpretation, the next moment when past and present briefly touch across the divide of centuries. The shrines are patient. They've waited this long. They can wait for us to catch up.